Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Watson Institute's Faculty Research Series. My name is Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. I'm an associate professor in sociology at Brown University and affiliated faculty at the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, Illinois. I'm pleased to have a chance today to speak with my colleague, Dr. Jayanti Owens. She is an assistant professor in sociology and international and public affairs at Brown University. In addition to being a faculty member at the Watson Institute at Brown, Professor Owens is also an affiliated faculty with the Population and Studies Training Center, the Annenberg Institute for Education and Policy, and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. Professor Owens was recently awarded one of the William T. Grant Early Career Faculty Scholar Awards by the William T. Grant Foundation for her work to reduce racial disparity in school discipline. This is a highly competitive and prestigious interdisciplinary award that's given annually to 3 to 6 scholars across the United States who are doing work to reduce social inequality. The foundation's press release states that scholars receive $350,000 to execute a rigorous 5-year research plan that stretches their skills and knowledge into new disciplines, content areas, or methods. Overall, Professor Owens does visionary work at the nexus of where school and education collide with our system of criminal justice and notions of punishment. So thank you, Professor Owens, for joining us today and talking about your research and your work. And I always like to start with a very basic question about what inspired you to think about race and school discipline and education.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today and for this opportunity to speak about the work that I've been doing with you. It really is a treat. So to sort of jump in around this question of where I became interested in the intersections of race and school discipline, part of it is that I was just quite frankly astounded by some of the statistics around this. So African-American students are over 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than their white counterparts. Native American students are 2 times as likely. Even Latino students are about 50% more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than their white counterparts. And these statistics are staggering because about 3.5 million children per year in a given academic school year are suspended or expelled from school. So these are not small numbers. This is affecting millions of kids and disproportionately students of color. And I think the second part is that I have done a bunch of research using longitudinal data sets to try to sort of investigate this question about what causes these disparities in school discipline, because as someone who does policy relevant research, my interest is sort of what can we do to reduce these racial disparities? What can we do to actually attend to this problem? Just vast amounts of data show that these disparities exist, but that doesn't really tell us what we do to change them. So my research is really grounded on this principle that in order to start changing these disparities, reducing them, we need to first understand what's driving them. And by then understanding what's driving them, we can design policies and practices to help intervene.
Well, as someone who studies race and racism in the criminal justice system, it's hard in this era not to reflect on just how difficult it's been to just pitch to academia or policymakers that quote unquote race mattered. And now we've seen this shift to, where the media, academia more broadly is finally acknowledging, wow, there's this thing called race and racism or bias and prejudice, and it seems to matter. Can you just comment a little bit about how difficult it was studying race, or starting at least in the Obama era when people were unwilling to talk about race, or the belief system that we were, is that we're post-racial, and maybe how it is now that you're kind of beginning this new project that really looks at the racial basis for school discipline. Talk to me a little bit about that.
I think that there's really been a tremendous shift, certainly within academia, where people tend to be a little bit more open to understanding the sort of scientific evidence behind race and racism. But even in the popular discourse, just there's been sort of certain things that have happened in our society in the last several years, and obviously a huge sort of tradition of discrimination long before that. But especially in the last last few years where it's just been undeniable. The killings of African Americans in full visibility on national television, the Black Lives Matter movement, and most recently the events at the Capitol building. It's really sort of now been connected to actually our fundamental democracy. And I think that when that happens, certainly for people of color who experience discrimination all the time, this is nothing new in terms of the headlines and the news and their lived experiences, but now it's something that is undeniable for many white people who have previously sort of not had to face the reality because it didn't impinge upon their daily life.
Well, and I think one of the issues that I faced is, um, I study judges and lawyers and police officers, and there is this sense because of the type of profession that they're in, they're public servants. How could they be biased? And I think the same thing is with teachers and principals is no one goes into being a teacher or principal and saying, well, I want to mistreat children or be biased towards children. And so I guess the question is, how do you in some ways start to work with schools to have them even consider that bias could be present among well-intentioned and of educators that are trained in some ways to really help children?
That's a fabulous question. And honestly, this is one of the areas where I just think sociology and sociological research is just tremendously central to the policy discussion. I think that the way that you do this is that or one way that you can do this is really sort of recognize the structural underpinnings of racism. And so, individuals can be completely well-intentioned, not have a sort of harming bone in their body, and yet they can sort of reify or sort of rehearse these practices that are so ingrained in our society. And so it's not about telling individual teachers, in my opinion, that they're biased. And frankly, I think that that is where a lot of the research around bias and discrimination sort of ends, right? It's about taking an implicit associations test and being told that you're biased and, well, shoot, what do you do with that, right? Whereas if you really think about it as a larger process that's grounded in our policies, our culture, our institutions, our organizations, the practices that we hold, that this becomes much more of a policy conversation. And I do think that that's where you can really move the needle, is thinking about how we restructure our practices as organizations, and that includes very much schools.
And that to me is thinking about the parallels between what you're doing in schools and what I think about in the criminal justice system. It seems as though even with sociologists, it's easy to consider that there might be one biased actor, but yet it's harder for people to accept that the institution itself is made up of many different actors working in particular ways, well, whether it be culture and norms of practice, that it's larger than the individual. And yet, how are you thinking about that kind of layered effect? So you mentioned implicit bias, but how does the bias of a teacher or multiple teachers then influence the structure, organization, institution, or the larger picture of maybe structural racism or something much larger than the school itself?
So one thing that just very concretely that I'm doing in my work is that I'm actually looking at how certain characteristics of schools, specific things like their racial and socioeconomic composition, the leadership structure of their school, their policies in terms of zero tolerance versus more sort of restorative justice oriented policies, how these factors really influence the types of ways that teachers perceive what could actually be identical misbehavior. So one of the things that I'm doing in my experimental work is that I am sort of capturing these video vignettes of students of different racial ethnic backgrounds and showing them to teachers who exist within very different school structures. And what this does is it allows me to say, basically, here's what would happen if the exact same type of behavior was done by, for example, an African American student in a predominantly white school versus in a predominantly African American school, in a predominantly free and reduced price lunch school versus a predominantly affluent school. And by doing that, we're able to really measure bias and discrimination in a way that we haven't been able to before, because we can now actually say, this is the counterfactual. This is what would have happened to this student had they been white. this is what would have happened to the student had they been in a different type of school system. And so you can really identify at that point what are the causal mechanisms that are driving these disparities that we see at a national level, also at a school and organizational or district level.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I think to me, the idea that context matters, right? Seeing, we just saw these events at the Capitol. We saw that the police kind of read these Trump protesters as not being violent, yet many of them were carrying weapons and taking, just, causing destruction. And so it strikes me as so parallel to your work, which is how is a certain action read by a Black student in this context of the school. And I think that we're missing those pictures, those contextual factors that really shape the perceptions of the teachers themselves. Is that part of the WT grant research?
Yeah, absolutely. It's extraordinarily sort of centered to the work, actually. In the first part of this work, which I'm sort of wrapping up right now, one of the things that I did is I fielded an experiment, a video experiment online with about 1,100 teachers around the country. And what I found is that by showing teachers, randomly assigning to teachers videos of students of African American, Latino or Latinx, and white backgrounds who are engaging in identical misbehavior, and then asking them to simply describe in a few sentences what they saw in those videos, right? By then going back and qualitatively coding those textual responses, what we found is that actually identical misbehavior, the very same exact infraction that was within the classroom, that students responded in the exact same way to the teacher and to the student who did the behavior, keeping sort of all situational and contextual factors constant, only varying the race of the student. Basically what we found is that teachers used much more blaming language when they were describing what was in fact identical misbehavior by African American and Latino as compared to white students. So really this mechanism of perception really gets at the heart of what you're talking about with regard to the recent events at the Capitol as well, right? I mean, I was struck listening to an NPR story recently about the sort of contrast between what the Capitol looked like in advance of the Black Lives Matter protests versus in advance of frankly, the mob that arrived at the Capitol this past week. I mean, it was really striking. In the one hand, you had quite sort of straightforward, like peaceful protest, right? That was met with what looked like a militia on the front steps of the Capitol that was creating a very clear barricade, fully armed, not at all sort of shy about using tear gas or other sort of quite sort of militant sort of strategies to sort of keep the peace, so to speak, in what was otherwise a peaceful protest. And then you had the sort of stark sort of difference with the mob that was attacking the Capitol and really just wreaking havoc and violent havoc within the Capitol, where the police were completely not prepared for this. They were, in fact, like very much deterred by what was happening and not sort of preparing or proposing a strong counterfront. And I think that a lot of that does have to do with the way that we read behavior differently when it's done by Black people and when it's done by white people.
Right.
And I think that that is a real undeniable component of what we are seeing in terms of this political shift that we're seeing.
Right. And it's, if anybody's been following, just the lack of accountability in police involved shootings, think about Tamir Rice, who had a toy gun in his hand, and yet white protesters could have, zip ties and why I think someone brought in like rope to tie people up, possibly. I mean, people are still speculating and the information still kind of coming forward. But it's amazing that people with actual weapons were still read in these kind of sympathetic ways. I think you said something about teachers casting blame. There's an equivalent term in criminology. People talk about blameworthiness, and that Black and Latino defendants are often labeled as blameworthy. And, that gets back to the basics of, the rhetoric of race and racism. And so I guess in your work, when you think about this blaming, what kind of analysis do you do to talk about racism? I mean, it may be intentional, it may be unintentional, unintentional, but how do you theoretically provide analysis in your study?
Yeah, so it's through the fact that we're manipulating race in these video vignettes, right? And so we know that everything is the same except for the behavior of the student. And we're able to say, this is how the exact same behavior in the exact same situational context was read differently. And we do that very systematically based on coding. We developed a coding scheme, and we went back and coded the language that teachers were using when they saw a Black student slamming a door versus when they saw a white student slamming the door. And that sort of provides us some of the causal traction that we need to be able to say that this was in fact due to the race of the person, of the student, and not something about the way that they were behaving differently, right? Because we were working with trained actors. So, we worked with a director and a cinematographer and a video editing team, and trained actors. And so everything was the same.
So tell me about that. I mean, it sounds fascinating. And I think, for all the kind of methods geeks out there that might tune in, or students that like to kind of think about ways to innovate with methods, this sounds extremely innovative. So I think in social psych about, kind of manipulating an experiment, but this has the video component. So how did you design and work with the director and find casting? And there's so many interesting sociological, methodological problems and solutions that you probably had to work with. So tell me a little bit about that, because it sounds just fascinating.
Yeah, so the premise of the video really goes back to this sort of adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so it's this idea that this is especially important when it comes to sensitive issues around race, because in the existing work, the researchers are doing things like using racially coded names. They are often sometimes even pointing out the race of the protagonist in the course of the written vignette. And all of this we sort of know can lead to cluing in the respondent to sort of what is going on, right? That this is a study about race, whereas the videos allowed us to just not have to say anything about the race of the student, right? It was just visible, it was present in front of them, and they were left to make whatever judgments they were going to with that. When it comes to the actual design of the vignettes, what we did was started by doing interviews with teachers, and we just asked them this very simple question of, what are the most common types of behavioral infractions that you see in your classroom that equally occur across students of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? So we know that there's a ton of misbehavior that's sort of racially coded, in that it's much more likely to happen by a Black student or a Latino student, for example, than a white student. We were not interested in those types of behaviors, because then off the bat, you're cluing teachers in who might be responding to the study that this is something that would be unrealistic for a white student. We wanted things that were just run of the mill, happen every day, and are highly subjective in terms of the way that they're interpreted across students of different racial ethnic backgrounds. So things like baggy pants, that's an example of a race specific type of sort of quote infraction, right? You don't often see white students, it's sort of tagged as being an African-American thing to have your
Aesthetic. Yeah.
Whereas things like slamming a door or throwing a projectile object during a class test, or texting, sending text messages, right? These are things that kids of all colors and backgrounds do. And so we needed for it to be believable and subjective. And so over the course of these interviews, we came up with a list of 15 or 20 things that teachers kind of repeatedly said. And once we had those, we sat down with a director and basically asked him, what of these can we actually realistically film in a way that would allow us to standardize these behaviors, given that we're working with human actors where there's going to be variability. And we came up with a list of 3. And we then sort of started the process of writing scripts and revising them and testing them out with Amazon Mechanical Turk workers and others to just sort of get a sense of whether these were believable and how people were going to respond to them.
And that's interesting too, because as a scholar of race and racism, I mean, what we're talking about is that certain aesthetics are racialized, and certain behaviors are more considered race neutral, and therefore would be better at testing. And so it's funny because there is this kind of denial that, oh, I don't see race. And I think there was this denial in academia. I don't see race, people are colorblind, and it's especially, pertinent to those who are more educated. Bonilla Silva's research about, more educated people can conceal racial bias and how they talk. And I think what you're saying is that you had to kind of see race to design this study. Like, we have to admit that there are certain behaviors that can be attributed to Black students or Latino students, or you have to admit and say, well, maybe this texting is more of a race neutral. So if you have kids of different races doing it and we see different teachers reacting in different ways, we now can really distill, okay, see, this is how race matters. Is that, I mean, was it,
That's exactly
you have
right.
to see race? I mean, was it difficult because given the context of academia that tells us, no, we shouldn't be seeing race, or almost assuming that race is a non-issue?
Yeah, I mean, I drew really heavily on the literature and sociology of race when thinking about, for example, actor recruitment, right? So, one of the things that we were really sort of attuned to was this question of skin color and colorism, right? So, it doesn't mean the same thing if you're a light skinned African American or a light skinned Latino and you do something as if you're an African American who's very dark skinned, right? Or if you're a Latino and you're very indigenous looking as opposed to sort of white passing. That even within categories that there is tremendous heterogeneity in the way that your behaviors are going to be read. So we made a point to also think about skin color diversity when it came to recruitment of our actors.
So did you, I think about Jennifer Eberhardt and, social psychologists in courtrooms. They would, people wanted to look at sentencing disparity, and they thought that they could distill, bias as sentencing outcomes. And many of these social psych folks said, no, 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 there could be this kind of within racial difference. So of course, people darker skinned might get more blameworthy in higher sentences than someone who's light skinned, or even racialized feature like the shape of someone's nose or the texture or style of someone's hair. So is there a within, I mean, do you know if there's within racial differences too?
There are, but this is where things get a little bit tricky because, as you said, teachers are educated respondents, right? They not only are educated in terms of their subject matter expertise and what they teach, but also in terms of the fact that they've probably gone through a fair bit of training around issues of diversity and racial inequality in classrooms, and are very sensitized to this. And going back to your earlier point about having good intentions, right? I mean, many teachers they went into the teaching field because of good intentions, the desire to help educate our future generation. And so they're really sensitive and attuned, perhaps more than many people in the sort of lay population around issues of race. And so we had to think really creatively about how we were going to go about asking these questions. Of course, I mentioned the fact that the videos allowed us to not have to explicitly say anything about race. That was great. But on top of that, we included things like a social desirability scale. So going to your point about the social psychological research in this area, there is research that shows that you can actually ask people a series of 4 or 5 questions and get a sense of how succumb they are to social desirability pressure. And so what that is, social desirability pressure, is this idea that certain types of people, certain individuals, are going to be more likely to feel that they have to respond in a socially acceptable way.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you ideally can do in this sort of a survey is that you can ask people those questions at the very end of the survey, and you can get feedback that tells you that you can compare teachers who had the same score on this social desirability scale, one of whom saw a Black student, one of whom saw a white student, and you can say what on average was the difference among teachers who had the same susceptibility to social desirability. And so these are some of the tactics that we used in the survey to think about some of these questions.
It's interesting because I think in this Trump era, I mean, again, I started my research in grad school in the Obama era, and people were really very good at concealing racial, you know, or working in colorblind rhetoric. I don't see race. Or my prosecutors would say, I don't see race, I see a case. They even had a catchphrase for it. And then I think about this Trump era where you have this kind of polarization. You have many liberals who are voting for Biden, but are still possibly engaging in these types of bias behaviors. But then you also have people that have kind of doubled down and say, hey, this is, on the Trump side, that are more overt and are actually saying that, talking the way they talk about Black Lives Matter, it's more polarized than before. And so does that change any of these I'm curious, even like, if you're researching in the Deep South, and many of these teachers like, I don't believe in race, and but I do think those people, and then they say something really biased about Black people. Do you think that maybe there might be more explicit racism in some of these teachers' responses, even their ability to say, I don't want to teach a type of book, or I don't want to I'm just curious if it complicates things more, that something really has shifted in the fabric of America that has created like this deep polarization. And what are
So
you thinking as you go forward?
of course, yeah. So this is one of the reasons that I think that social scientists have to think really creatively about issues of measurement, right? And so one of the ways that we've dealt with that in our project is that we've kind of come to terms with the fact that, look, you can give people scales and you can ask them to respond on scales, but those scales really allow people to self-censor in ways that it's much harder to do when you're asking students, or asking teachers rather, to simply describe in sentences what they saw in a student's behavior, for example. So what we found is that it's a lot harder to self-censor in that type of qualitative text box, right? Like if teachers are just asked, tell us what you saw, open-ended response, simply just coding the ways, the adjectives that they use, the what they sort of label as disrespect versus what they label as a student just having a bad day, right? That these sort of subtleties are really hard to capture in quantitative scales in a way that you can do much more so in qualitative text. And so that's one of the innovations that we use, that we found really was where we saw a lot of the action in terms of where bias was coming up.
And I think that's great that you brought this up about this kind of qualitative, quantitative. There's such a divide in so many social sciences. And I think what you're talking about is this necessity of both, and that how the two can work together. And I mean, to me, it feels deeply satisfying because it really is telling us the whole picture, is that we're missing something by not using both, right? There's something that, only quantitative work alone is still concealing some of the deeper, much more interesting or theoretically interesting issues of how bias kind of works out. So I think that's wonderful. My question for you is, you had a social forces piece out about racial disparity in school discipline. Can you tell us a little bit about those findings as well?
I think this is a great segue from your last question as well, because the one of the things that I really found in doing that paper that just came out in Social Forces not too long ago was basically that we found that about 50% of the Black-white gap in school discipline in elementary school was attributable to the fact that African-American students who were entering school with the exact same teacher-rated and parent-rated behavioral problems as white students were much more likely to get suspended from school, right, by the end of elementary school. And one of the issues there was that with the longitudinal data that we were using, we were unable to get at this underlying mechanism of blameworthiness that you mentioned, right? And that we then moved on to study in the experiment, because we were relying on sort of observational ratings by teachers and parents. So on the one hand, these are really fantastic ratings because they give us a full sense of teachers' assessments of students' everyday behaviors and parents' assessments. And they're very sort of independent of any sort of suspension outcome that might occur down the road. So that's fabulous from a design perspective. But what it meant was that we were unable to see whether the very ratings that teachers were giving were themselves racially biased, right? So when a teacher says that a student who happens to be African American has inattention problems or has hyperactivity problems or conduct disorder type problems, is aggressive and can't sit still, these types of behaviors, we don't know what the objective standard is that they are using in their mind to say that this happens rarely or frequently or always or never, right? And same for the white student. So what that means is we can't disentangle without an objective standard what constitutes frequently. And frequently might be different if you're Black than if you're white.
Right. Right.
And so that's really what motivated the heart of the experiment, was the recognition that we find in this paper this very powerful finding: 50% of the Black-white gap in elementary school discipline is attributable to the differential treatment of African-American students as compared to white students for the same school entry behaviors. But we don't know if it's really differential treatment, which is a more sort of overt or even potentially unintentional, but nonetheless sort of very visible form of discrimination, Or if it's that the very sort of rating scale that teachers are using is different. So it actually could be that they're not harshly treating African American students more so, but rather that what for them constitutes frequently could be a much lower bar if you're African American than if you're white. And
Right.
we just couldn't disentangle that.
Right.
And so this is kind of even more to your point that the use of multiple methods, right? Whether it's experiments or longitudinal survey analysis or interviews and ethnography, really there's just gaps in each of them that
Mhm.
really require the use of multiple methods to be able to fill. And that has been one of the most exciting parts for me about going down this work.
And that, again, like when I hear you summarize this research, I keep thinking about what current events and what white protesters or rioters were able to get away with versus, right? So even the signaling of certain behaviors or a political affiliation, like saying I'm protesting for Black lives, makes you criminal versus having zip ties and brandishing, a pole to break through a window is like, okay, when you're talking about this notion of frequency, you know, when you think about a Black child versus a white child, how frequently does the Black child get to have ordinary misbehavior, right? It's interesting that, these biases work in these subtle ways, in that it never is overt, but it kind of, masquerades, if you will, in other types of, behavior. So how frequency you get, kind of a free pass, or a somewhat of a free pass to be bad once in a while if you are a white child, but very rarely if you're a Black child. Is that like a
Exactly.
simplified
Yep,
way of thinking about it?
exactly. It's really the sort of like prevalence of just surveillance before you're already judged before you even lift a finger. And that is something that one of the best studies that I've seen around this, a study done by Walter Gilliam and his colleagues with preschool children in sort of pre-K programs around Connecticut, basically found that when you gave teachers videos of preschool kids playing totally normally, a
Mhm.
diverse group of preschool kids playing totally normally, no misbehavior to be had, and you put eye tracking software on the teachers and you ask them to find misbehavior in the videos, guess where they look? Before even any misbehavior is present, they're looking at the African American students, and in particular, the African American boys. And
Yeah.
so that was a big motivation for me in this work that I'm doing now, because I recognized that there's going to be this perception of blameworthiness even before there's any blame to be assigned.
Right.
And that, I think, gets at the psychological processes.
Right.
For me, what is great about this experiment that I'm doing now is that it allows us to layer on top of that, as you mentioned earlier, this understanding that the context of the school additionally shapes that. So in the Gilliam study, they said, look, teachers are much more likely to look at African American boys before they've done anything wrong. Okay, that's the surveillance and the blameworthiness piece. But my question was, okay, we know that that's happening. How is it happening differently in different types of schools? And this gets at really the issue of structural racism, structural bias, is that we found it's much more likely to happen in the schools that are already most disadvantaged. So in contexts where you have predominantly African American and Latino students at the school, that premonition or that perception that there's going to be misbehavior is even more heightened. And it goes to this sort of culture of surveillance and policing that so many sociologists, Victor Rios and others, have talked about. We know that that's already there in the very fabric of the school and of the school process for those kids. And this really shows with an experiment that is happening in a systematic way for teachers all around the country, and for their students in minority schools.
Wow. I'm thinking about an experience, I had in Philadelphia. I lived in Philadelphia for a while. And my husband and I turned on the local Philadelphia, it was like a hearing about the state of schools, and school board was listening to community leaders, et cetera. And this teacher who worked in a very impoverished area, she had little resources. She had a kindergarten class of all African American children. She was an African American teacher, and she literally was in tears crying to the school board about how some kids were becoming violent. And as she described this, she described tantrums where kids were covering their ears or having meltdowns. They might have thrown things, but what, anybody who studies disabilities or knows anything about ADHD or sensory integration disorder or mild autism, it really sounded not as quote unquote bad behavior, but kids that had undiagnosed disabilities or possibly trauma. And um there was no way to kind of distill, like, even how she was describing it, it was a behavior problem versus begging the school district for additional resources. So back to our question about, who gets a free pass, I guess the question is, and it's maybe more provocative, do Black children get to be labeled disabled? I mean, do they ever, if they're exhibiting some symptoms like a tantrum or screaming and covering their ears, like at a young age, is that's labeled disruptive versus someone who might need interventions, might need extra resources, might need an IEP? How do we think about disability studies as it intersects with some of this behavioral disciplinary issues?
So I think you're absolutely right to point out that disabilities are also racially coded. And so disabilities like ADHD, disorders like ADHD, are often thought of as sort of white disorders. It's perfectly socially acceptable if you're a sort of middle class or affluent white parent for your child to get diagnosed with ADHD or a learning disability, dyslexia. These are sort of examples of coded white disabilities, right? And with that is the social assumption that there's actually nothing wrong with the student, but rather that they have been disadvantaged by having this disability placed upon them, and that we need to sort of treat the symptoms that they're manifesting so that their true nature, which is intelligent and brilliant and athletic and
Native, yeah,
sociable,
yep,
can
yep.
shine through, can finally shine through, right? Whereas for students of color, the understanding is, oh, no, 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 this is actually the fundamental nature of that student.
Mm.
And we need to find a way to tamper that fundamental essence, right? We need to find a way to sort of strap it down, for lack of a better sort of term. And what that means is, you see in the medical literature, for example, that not only are there racial disparities in the types of disabilities that white kids and Black kids get assigned, but on top of that, that the treatment patterns also differ tremendously. So even when you have African-American students, a small minority of them who get diagnosed with ADHD, they're much more likely to get treated with antipsychotics for ADHD rather than things like stimulants, or even if they get diagnosed with depression, to get antipsychotics as opposed to antidepressants. And so even the pharmaceutical labels themselves are racially coded in ways that just belie the fundamental difference in the way that we interpret identical misbehavior by students based on the color of their skin, based on their racial ethnic background.
Wow, that to me is absolutely sobering. I think that the troubling issue is that, there's almost this issue, if students of color were labeled to have a disability, it would afford them resources. And I think about in my work, many of the attorneys that look at defendants and say, well, this person has mental health issues. They look at resources as someone kind of milking the system. They actually treat people with real mental illness that is very visible, and sometimes it's so bad, right? So if your mental illness has gone untreated and you end up in a criminal court, I mean, this is the worst case scenario. It's not a solution to mental illness. But even once it hits that level of a problem, they kind of treat the defendants as almost like welfare recipients, meaning you're milking they're using welfare tropes. And I wonder if the same is not true here. Like, you brought up this idea of this is the true nature of this child. Attorneys in my study called it defuturized, that Black young people were defuturized. They weren't envisioned with future and potential. But this is the other side of it, which is if you are labeled, quote unquote, to have a disability that is legitimate, it affords you resources and somewhat protection. And I wonder if there is some of this, no, you're not getting any resources from the state. That part of
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is again where it goes back to these structural issues, because we already know that the schools that African American Latino students are likely to attend are under resourced. And within that, they have larger class sizes, they have a greater tendency towards punitive zero tolerance policies. They're strapped in terms of having resources like a school nurse or a guidance counselor who can actually pay attention to them, or any number of sort of other sort of supplementary educational resources. And so when you have a student in that context, it's very difficult to disentangle what is going on that is actually discrimination versus what is going on that is actually just their resources are overstretched. Like there is no access to this stuff because these resources just don't exist at these schools.
Right.
And I think it's very easy for parents and district leaders in more affluent districts to say, that's not racism, that's not bias, that's not discrimination, that's just the structural reality. And what I would push back and say is, no, that actually is the definition of structural discrimination. It is the fact that these schools don't have the ability to treat in the same ways the types of behaviors that we know happen for all kids, but that in some cases where you have disadvantage, structural disadvantage, there's just no option to get the type of help that you need.
That's so fascinating. I think that to me is a perfect segue to say, from a policy standpoint, what can we do to help some of these issues of inequality? Where do we go from here? Where do we go?
So I mentioned this earlier, this idea that I think where the sort of research and literature is now is this idea that, we can pinpoint individual bias, but where do we go from there, right? And how do you actually, how useful or productive is it to tell teachers individually that, you have a high implicit bias score, right? So what I'm trying to do in my work is I'm trying to actually design what I'm calling a diagnostic tool. And what that tool does is it helps schools at a school level or district level understand what are the mechanisms that are driving the disparities that they see at their school. So it's not just, okay, the Civil Rights Office says you have these huge disparities, go figure it out, but it's actually taking the next step and saying, before you can design policies to address a particular disparity, you have to know, is it coming from the fact that your teachers are seeing identical misbehavior as being more blameworthy when it's a Black student than a white student? Is it instead something else? Is it that they are seeing the behavior as being similarly blameworthy, but are much more readily referring it to the principal's office? Or is it that at the point of a student being referred to the principal's office, the administrator is interpreting that referral differently and assigning a harsher sanction? These are just three examples of the types of mechanisms that we just quite frankly don't have the empirical evidence yet to disentangle, and yet they point to very different policy interventions. And so what I'm doing in this diagnostic tool is giving schools the chance to understand, not at an individual teacher level, but at a school level, what is going on at our school, and then being able to have conversations based on that experimental evidence, where they can figure out, we don't need a blanket intervention. What we need is to know what's driving our disparity so that we can, as empowered teachers and administrators, figure out what's going to work in our context.
So this might be interesting to you. One of the founding fathers of sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, when he was a young boy, in the South, he was caught stealing a handful of grapes in a farmer's field, and he was put into the juvenile justice system. And it was his it was his school principal that actually vouched for him in front of the judge, because they were going to sentence Du Bois to kind of like a juvenile boot camp, the equivalent of that era that we would have, the juvenile justice system. And I think it was astounding that the principal had to say, no, this is a good kid. He is a child with potential. Do not involve the criminal justice system. And I guess from your standpoint, looking at teachers and principals, how often with school discipline are they deploying people to the criminal justice system or saving kids from the criminal justice system? Because I think about Du Bois and think about, wow, one of these great American thinkers, and here, because he was a Black child, the principal ended up being a key mediator. And I think it's so relevant today. What, in your findings, how close are we from the school to prison pipeline on the one hand, or do you see principals trying and teachers understanding the consequences of what that entry point means?
So I can sort of think about this with regard to a piece of research out there that I find to be extremely important in this regard. So there was an intervention designed by Jason Okunofua and his colleagues, and what they found is that if you gave teachers a training where you asked them to think about and list a variety of different reasons that students might misbehave that have nothing to do with a lack of interest or commitment to school, what would that do for the ways that the teachers' sort of mindsets shifted and the way that they approached their students in their classrooms in real life might change? And what they found is that by simply giving teachers what they call this empathy intervention, by simply, in some ways, it was actually a very structural intervention, right? Because even though it was operating at the individual teacher level and was psychological in that sense, it was nonetheless asking them to tap into structural disadvantage and structural realities of disadvantage. And in doing that, changed the way that the teachers approached their assumptions about what was going on that made a student misbehave. So I think you're absolutely right to say that these teachers and principals, administrators have just as much opportunity to be the sponsors that prevent kids from going into the school to prison pipeline, into the juvenile justice system, as they do for sort of siphoning them in there. And so I think that that's just such an important point, especially when it comes to teacher professional development and in-service in development, is just this idea that actually every day that you're in the classroom, you have an opportunity to prevent a child from getting sucked into that system. And I think that really can change, the way that teachers approach their jobs. At the same time, I don't want to diminish the structural realities that many teachers are working within, where that is a luxury to have the time to be able to think about that. I mean, so many of our teachers are underpaid and overworked, and that is not something that can be addressed by an empathy intervention, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I wonder if that, as we kind of wind up today, I wonder if that is the key objective is how do we get educators to, in some ways, stop the school to prison pipeline? How do we, is that the goal, right? Is to get them to understand and see, how these biases in school discipline can then manifest to a larger path that is so much more harmful to their lives. And maybe that could be one goal is in stopping the school to prison pipeline.
I agree. And I also would take this opportunity to just make the plug for the fact that, you talked earlier about self-fulfilling prophecies. As a country, we undervalue our teachers. We don't pay them nearly what they're worth, and we don't recruit the very best teachers that we can because of the incentives that, it's obvious to a teacher, someone who's thinking about going into elementary or secondary education in this country, when they're leaving college, that they could get paid 4 or 5 times as much if they went to a consulting firm or if they went to work for a private business. And I think that that's sending the wrong message about what value teachers have in our country. And so I would say that it is right to have high expectations for teachers, but I think it's also extremely important to recognize that we need to put our money where our mouth is in terms of setting policy and setting, frankly, salaries for teachers.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much to our Institute Director, Edward Steinfeld, and everyone at the Watson Institute who made this event possible. Professor Owens, thank you so much for talking with us on your really important research, this visionary research. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.